is Series 3 of Away, a podcast for anyone exploring 12-step sobriety. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 2 of series 3. We are delving into the 12 steps and 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, often referred to as the 12 and 12. Last week's episode was an intro, but really a rant, I think, more than anything. So today we're going to start from the beginning with the foreword to the current edition of the 12 and 12. Alcoholics Anonymous is a worldwide fellowship of more than 100,000 alcoholic men and women who are banded together to solve their common problems and to help fellow sufferers in recovery from that age-old baffling malady, alcoholism. When this edition was published in 2003, it was estimated that over 2 million have recovered through AA. I don't know if the estimate should really be recovered or just are in the rooms of AA. Moving on. This book deals with the 12 steps and the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It presents an explicit view of the principles by which AA members recover and by which their society functions. AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which, if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. So key words there are a group of principles, not rules, not hard and fast anything. Spiritual in their nature, which, if you listen to either of my first 2 series, I talk about spirituality as being of the self, as finding the goodness within, the moral compass within. It doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural. Spiritual, in my opinion, can encompass many different things. And then the last part of that sentence, can expel the obsession to drink. I wish it had the word therefore. Can expel the obsession to drink and therefore enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. And how I'd really like to word it is, can expel the obsession to drink and therefore enable the sufferer to become happier and feel wholer. In my experience, the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous do not solve all of life's problems, but they give you a fighting chance at solving life's problems. That was my dog burping. And I think I probably made my opinion clear. The 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous help you stop drinking. That's the point. They alone don't actually lead to complete happiness and a perfect life, but they do help you to clear the fog and get on the right track. That said, because I see the steps as sort of a euphemistic construction of what is ultimately basic cognitive behavioral principles, I do think that some of the ideas within them can be used to help in other parts of life. Like 6 and 7 can help anyone. I see my defect, damage, defense, whatever it is, and I try to change it in the moment. I try to stop the negative automatic thought and turn it around. But I only think this once you stop drinking. Get the big one out of the way. First things first, as they say. Skipping down the page a little, Alcoholics Anonymous began in 1935 in Akron, Ohio, as the outcome of a meeting between a well-known surgeon and a New York broker Both were severe cases of alcoholism and were destined to become co-founders of the AA Fellowship. So, Bill W. wrote this. Might be a little exaggerated. If you've listened to my previous series, you know a lot about the history of AA by now. You know this story well. The surgeon, maybe not so well known, is Dr. Bob. The broker, also probably not so well known, is Bill W. It's rather a long story, so to keep it short, really short, they were brought together by Henrietta Seiberling in Akron, where they met on her estate in her gatehouse. And AA was born right there, one alcoholic talking to another. After 3 years of trial and error in selecting the most workable tenets upon which the society could be based, and after a large amount of failure in getting alcoholics to recover, 3 successful groups emerged. The first at Akron, the second in New York, and the third at Cleveland. The third they're talking about here is Bill Dotson. That is my dog eating a polka dog cod skin. So the third they're talking about here is Bill Dotson. You may already know him as the man on the bed in that painting. And I think his story's on page 182 of the big book. I'm skipping back a little bit. The basic principles of AA, as they are known today, were borrowed mainly from the fields of religion and medicine, though some ideas upon which success finally depended were the result of noting the behavior and needs of the fellowship itself. So by now you also know that many of the principles contained within were borrowed from religion, and I will make mention of that going forward. The Oxford group's tenets are the most present in the big book, and less so here. I think we see a lot more of Bill's personality in this book, his darker side. Carl Jung, of course, William James, and when we reach the steps that I see their presence most, I will talk more about them. But please go back and listen to Series 2. The first couple of episodes are about the history of AA, and that'll clarify some of this a little bit, if you're interested. If you're not, it doesn't really matter or affect the rest of this series. Okay, moving on. Nevertheless, the Infant Society determined to set down its experience in a book which finally reached the public in April 1939. That's the big book. At this time, the recoveries numbered about 100. The book was called Alcoholics Anonymous, and from its fellowship took its name. So again, really listen to the beginning of Series 2. I think that's the first couple of episodes, or first 3 episodes, are the strongest on the historical part of this. In it, alcoholism was described from the alcoholic's view, the spiritual idea of the society was codified for the first time in the 12 steps, and the application of these steps to the alcoholic's dilemma were made clear. Skipping down, the book Alcoholics Anonymous became the basic text of the fellowship, and it still is. This present volume, meaning the 12 and 12, proposes to broaden and deepen the understanding of the 12 steps as first written in the earlier work. Now, Bill actually, I think later, sort of felt like he'd given the steps the short shrift in the big book, because there isn't a huge amount on them. I mean, as I have said time and again, step 6 and 7 are super important, and they get like a paragraph or 2 in the book. So originally Bill had wanted to write this book about just the 12 traditions, and it sort of morphed, in part for saleability, into a further exploration of the steps. But he also thought the steps needed that, a more clear explication. It's funny, though, the thumpers or the diehards or whatever you want to call them, the more indoctrinated, big book indoctrinated people, whatever, don't really want to read the 12 and 12. And I'm uncertain why it's not as important to them. It really is like an Old Testament, like, anyway. I don't love the 12 and 12 personally either, but then, I'm not a huge fan of the big book as a whole. Okay, so moving down. Talking about the expansion of AA. Again, we talk a lot about that in Series 2. The startling expansion of the Fellowship of AA brought with it very severe growing pains. That's where the learning happens. It's in those growing pains, right? Proof that alcoholics could recover had been made. But it was by no means sure that such great numbers of yet erratic people could live and work together with harmony and good effect. Everywhere there arose threatening questions of membership, money, personal relations, public relations, management of groups, clubs, and scores of other perplexities. It was out of this vast welter of explosive experiences that AA's 12 traditions took form and were first published in 1946 and later confirmed at AA's first international convention held at Cleveland in 1950. The tradition section of this volume portrays in some detail the experience which finally produced the 12 traditions, and so gave AA its present form, substance, and unity. So we'll look at the history more again when we reach that part of the book. I'll just say for now that the traditions are not merely theories, right? Each of them were born of real experiences and real failures, and much like the 12 steps were of the individuals imparting the knowledge they had at the time. Now, what's interesting, too, is Bill may have been in a depression when he wrote the 12 and 12, in a dark period, but he also had a lot more experience as a sober individual. Setting aside that a lot of his other behaviors, including women, had not changed, he still had more years sober. And so I think more experience to impart about how to do it, about what it really means. Now, that is affected by his current state of mind when he's writing these down for the book. Okay. Before we move on, I need to preface it. Preface the first chapter, step 1, with a reminder, I guess. And I'll do it in the I. I am powerless over alcohol. I actually have a great deal of power over other things in my life. Choices to make. And you probably do too. I can exercise willpower without discomfort in many areas of my life. And personally, I'm happier when I'm leading a more disciplined life, as uncool as that sounds. I actually kind of think the human animal craves that. Which is why things like the 12 steps really do work for people. It gives a structure, an organization, a discipline. That said, I am totally powerless over alcohol. But here's the part that makes some people mad. I think I am powerless over alcohol only once I take a drink. That's kind of the idea behind the slogan, it's the first drink that gets you drunk. My early sobriety was focused on that idea alone. I was coming to AA for one reason, to stop drinking. Something that I had found very difficult without support. AA gave me that support. I came to AA knowing I had a problem with alcohol, But I came to understand that I was powerless over alcohol when I took a drink. So to me, there's a distinction between saying I am powerless over alcohol and I am powerless over alcohol when I take a drink. My experience has been that once I stopped drinking, taking the first drink became a choice. I am not saying that your first day, week, month in detox or rehab or the rooms, I'm not saying this is true in those early days necessarily. But once you've gotten through that physical addiction, whether you believe in God or not, you are going to have to exercise some willpower. If you have God, that's great. He's there to support you. Many people find God as they go through sobriety or as they go through the steps. So in those early days, you may not have God yet. You have the group to support you. But in the end, it is a choice that you have to make. So that very well may involve some willpower. You're going to have to make the choice each time you're tempted to drink to say no instead of yes. I promise in time the choice becomes easier and easier still with every day, with every week, month, year. And if you're like me, 8+ years on, you're never tempted. That's not true for everyone, but I'm just never tempted. I use the think it through tool a lot. Where does one drink get me? I do believe that I will always be powerless over alcohol the minute I take a drink. One beer, one shot, one glass of wine. Maybe it'll stop there. I doubt it. My experience drinking says it probably won't. I can't be certain what will happen or where I might end up. The drink itself, at this point for me, is my only trigger. I hope that makes sense. Taking a drink is my only trigger. I don't feel triggered by anything else right now. Terrible situations. I don't want to drink. I know it won't solve anything. I have no desire. It's only if I take a drink at this point in my sobriety that I'll be triggered, so to speak, to drink more. If I don't drink, I am, for all intents and purposes, recovered, not still recovering. The quote-unquote disease, as so many people like to call it, is in remission. The only way for it to return is if I feed it. So at this point, for me, my only trigger is to take a drink, and literally no part of me is tempted to do that. I'm not saying I will never be tempted again. Never say never. We can't say anything for sure. And that's why we keep doing the things to help ourselves so that should temptation occur, we have the tools. I can't possibly say that life events, which I have never experienced before, won't tempt me to drink. They very well may, but because of AA and the steps, I have an arsenal of weapons to combat the temptation. Temptation and alcoholism are just not the same thing. There's the mental obsession, which, the longer you stay sober, the less strong it gets. Your brain literally stops giving any power to that because you're not feeding it. It wants stuff that makes it feel good. If you're not giving it the thing that makes it feel good anymore, it dedicates less energy to it. That just is true. So it really will lessen with time. Temptation will go away. Desire will go away. That's not to say every now and then you won't think like, oh, a drink would be good now. But it's almost a joke. It's almost like yeah, but I would never. That's my experience. So even my mental obsession to drink has really gone away. Okay, that's quite a preface, isn't it? Let's go to read. Step 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Now, I like to say to a newcomer, because it seems dreadful to have to take on much more than just stopping drinking or drugs in the beginning. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable because of alcohol. Who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one. Okay, practically doesn't mean everyone. Practically means almost. There are certainly people who are fine with it, who or for whom letting go of power is fine. And just as a side note, believe it or not, many of them are atheists. I know people have this vision of the atheist as thinking man is the center of earth and everything, but that's just not true. Move down the page. Our admission of personal powerlessness finally turn out to be firm bedrock upon which happy and purposeful lives may be built. That bedrock. I am powerless over alcohol when I take a drink. The minute alcohol hits my bloodstream, I become powerless to it. That's in the beginning. You might find this a useful tool later to let go of things. But we're talking step 1 in AA. We know that little good can come to any alcoholic who joins AA unless he has first accepted his devastating weakness and all its consequences. Until he so humbles himself, his sobriety, if any, will be precarious. Of real happiness, he will find none at all. I mean, it's probably not true for everyone. Like, I've said it before, I had a drinking problem, not a living problem, once I took the drinking problem out of it. But I experienced happiness and whatever along the way. I did not have an entirely miserable existence. And this is where I start to see Bill's sort of dark period coming into it a little. And he clearly had a lot of trouble getting humble, right? I mean, his ego is pretty present. The principle that we shall find no enduring strength, we first admit complete defeat, is the main taproot from which our whole society has sprung and flowered. Yeah, so admitting you've got a problem that you need help to solve, that's the only way to change, period. Like most changes start with admitting you need to change. And oftentimes you do need help to make the change, or at least support of some kind. Okay. When first challenged to admit defeat, most of us revolted. I don't know if that's true. We approached AA expecting to be taught self-confidence. True. Then we had been told that so far as alcohol is concerned, self-confidence was no good whatever. In fact, it was a total liability. False. Totally false. Self-confidence is necessary for that happiness, for that freedom. Arrogance is not, right? Being proud of oneself and being prideful are different things. So just because Bill doesn't have any self-confidence at this point doesn't mean the rest of us can't. And it's going back to the big book and the language that doesn't work for a lot of us, that doesn't work for more sensitive people, that doesn't resonate with a lot of us, women especially. I can't speak to more sensitive men, the LGBTQ community, but I have to assume that many of us don't relate to that. We come looking for self-confidence and we get it. We get it. We get to be proud of ourselves every day for staying sober and in the beginning. And then because we've stayed sober, we can make all these other changes that we feel really proud of. So self-confidence in this context, I don't think is the right word. Replace it. Replace it. Bad attitude, arrogance, ego, but not ego in its healthy sense, right? Like egotistical. Our sponsors declared that we were the victims of a mental obsession so subtly powerful that no amount of human willpower could break it. There was, they said, no such thing as the personal conquest of this compulsion unaided by will. So I think this is kind of true. I think the word aid is the key, but I think that aid can be human. AA in the end works best for people who need support and aid of other people and are willing to ask for it. That isn't always immediate. Sometimes that takes time, and just showing up to meetings and getting to know people is one way to ultimately allow yourself to be vulnerable enough to ask for the help. So keep coming back is like a real thing. Relentlessly deepening our dilemma, our sponsors pointed out our increasing sensitivity to alcohol, an allergy they called it. The tyrant alcohol wielded a double-edged sword over us. First, we were smitten by an insane urge that condemned us to go on drinking, and then by an allergy of the body that ensured we would ultimately destroy ourselves in the process. Few indeed were those who, so assailed, had ever won through in single-handed combat. It's really hard to make this change alone. It was a statistical fact that alcoholics almost never recovered on their own resources, and this had been true apparently ever since man had first crushed grapes. Okay, so I can't with the ostentatious sort of language, but we can streamline it and also recondition or modernize some of the ideas here, right? So it is easier when admitting defeat, when admitting powerlessness, to do that with support, because it is hard sometimes to do. For many of us, it felt like giving up a best friend. It felt like giving up protection. It felt like giving up everything that had ever made us confident. And the truth is, I'm telling you, it's none of those things. But you have to stay sober to realize that, and for many of us, we need help. And if you don't have God yet, or you think you're never going to have God, like me, that's okay, because you do have the power of other people there to support you if you let them. That's kind of all that says. Okay, skipping ahead. Since step one requires an admission that our lives have become unmanageable, how could people such as these, meaning people with high bottoms, take this step? It was obviously necessary to raise the bottom the rest of us had hit to the point where it would hit them too. By going back in our own drinking histories, we could show that years before we realized it, we were out of control, that our drinking even then was no mere habit, that it was indeed the beginning of a fatal progression. So a lot of people will say, and I agree, there's sort of a line almost you can see at some point where you went from like social drinking that was maybe a little heavier than others into really alcoholic drinking. Maybe not. You know, you're lucky to come in with a high bottom. And this is, you hear people say, yet. Everything else was just a yet. And that's true. Like, if you keep drinking, a lot of stuff can happen. A lot of standards or bars you'd set, they get lower and lower. If there is evidence to you that once you start drinking, no matter how much, you're unlikely to stop of your own volition, and or the end result of most of your drinking is negative, you can identify the problem before it destroys you while life is still just unmanageable or just unbearable and not destroyed, right? So if you see these traits in your drinking, if you see these patterns in your life and in your drinking, you don't have to wait till you hit rock bottom as described in many of the stories, to stop the process. You can do this now. Hitting bottom is very personal, I think. For some, it's the first time they slurred, like at a party, and people noticed, or the first time they couldn't recollect the night before, or as simple as having one bottle of wine instead of 2 glasses, right? That may be enough for some people, knowing just the obsession is there. For others, it may be losing everything. For others, it may be an assault. Different thing. It's a very personal thing. There's no one bottom. You know how you feel. And there's no harm in trying to quit. So why all this insistence that every AA must hit bottom first? The answer is that few people will sincerely try to practice the AA program unless they've hit bottom. I don't think that's entirely true. Again, with a very personal bottom. And don't let people judge you for your bottom or say things like, I drank for more years than you've been alive. Fuck them. But every other change or improvement you want to ultimately make will be a lot easier without being drunk or hungover or in the vicious cycle all the time. Who wants to sacrifice time and energy in trying to carry AA's message to the next sufferer? No, the average alcoholic, self-centered in the extreme, doesn't care for this prospect unless he has to do these things in order to stay alive himself. I don't think that's true. I think many of the people I've encountered, myself included, want to give more to the world, want to help others, and were trying, even in their drinking, have been people pleasers in both a negative and positive way. I've found this especially with women who don't identify with that. Self-centered in the extreme. I mean, sure, some are, but some are out in the real world too, and it doesn't get them very much either. We may have appeared that way, or we may have behaved that way. That doesn't mean we are that. So some of our behaviors were selfish because we chose alcohol over showing up for a friend. But sometimes, not at all. This isn't true for everybody. Bad behavior, remember, doesn't equal a bad person. So just to start, on step 1, if you're new and listening to this, or if you're working with a sponsee, we're really just going to make not drinking instead of drinking. We're going to make not drinking our first priority. Once that's out of the way, once that's checked off our list, we can find that moral compass within that's always been there, that goodness. We were badly behaved, sometimes selfishly behaved. That doesn't necessarily mean we're either of those things. And for some people, those aren't their quote-unquote defects to begin with. So on that note, we'll say more to come as we hit step 2 in the 12 and 12 in the next episode. I love you all. I really do. If no one said I love you today to you, I'm saying it. And together, we will, I promise, find a way.